Good evening and welcome to the Baumer Lecture Series. This is the Knowlton School's premier lecture series, and this is the second in our autumn 2020 series, which has been reimagined for our current times as the Baumer Conversations, where we are joined by a leader in one of our core disciplines for a lecture, followed by a discussion paired with one of our own Knowlton School faculty. Today, we will hear from a thought leader in city and regional planning, Professor Joan Fitzgerald of Northeastern University, who will join me, and I'm Jennifer Clark, a professor and head of the city and regional planning section of the Knowlton School, for a conversation as well following her lecture. So Joan Fitzgerald is a professor of urban and public policy at Northeastern University. She is an expert in economic development who has written about equity and economic justice, including the importance of economic opportunity and access throughout her career. Her works on economic revitalization and labor market access established her as one of the leaders in economic development policy and planning in the US. Professor Fitzgerald's third book in 2010, Emerald Cities, Urban Sustainability and Economic Development, represented a pivot in her scholarship as she moved to integrate the movement towards urban sustainability with the economic development literature. And now today, she's going to talk with us about her new book, just out in March 2020, Greenovation, Urban Leadership on Climate Change, where she argues that the climate strategies of too many cities represent random acts of greenness, rather than integrated and aggressive action. She points to leading cities in North America and Europe and offers strategies for lagging cities to accelerate their action. Professor Fitzgerald is the editor of the Rutledge Regional Studies Association Regions and Cities book series. Her ongoing Climate Just Cities project examines strategies for post-COVID urban climate action to emphasize equity. She blogs on inequality and urban climate action on Plan Edison, a leading platform for planning debates and discussion. Now, before becoming a professor at Northeastern University, Joan also taught urban planning at the New School, the University of Illinois at Chicago, and she began her career here with us at the Ohio State University. And today we welcome her back here. Thank you, Joan, and we look so forward to the lecture and our conversation today.
Thank you for that introduction, Jennifer. Yes, my first appointment was at Ohio State University, and it looked nothing like I'm seeing in your background at the time. And I'm really disappointed that I can't be there live and see the new campus, the new building, and everything. So as Jennifer noted, the book came out on March 27th of this year. It was released on March 28th. Oxford University Press's distribution center closed down due to COVID. So everything's in the timing. And this was a book that there was no stock for many months after it was released. But that's the way it is. So what I'd like to do now is just share my screen and take you through some of the basics of the book and then move it to where my research is going now. So I'm going to share the screen. Okay, are we good?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I titled this talk Greenovation Plus because so much has happened since the book has been released. And in particular, that we're going to have to put equity at the forefront of everything we do in climate action. We've discovered that COVID-19 hits Black and Latino communities much harder. Not only are they much more likely to get the virus, much more likely to die from it, And this news just becomes more and more definitive as more evidence is gathered. And we can't ignore that. A good part of the reason is because these communities are often have many polluting sources in them. And so the first thing we have to do is remedy the wrongs that have been done to those communities environmentally as part of climate action. So I'm going to be taking you beyond the book. So here we are, Greenovation, the book. So what is Greenovation? I define several things. First, it's setting aggressive climate goals with a strategy and accountability for achieving them. Many cities have set aggressive climate goals, whether it's becoming net zero, climate neutral, 100% renewable. But what many cities that do this lack is a strategy and an accountability showing along the way how they're going to achieve that and what they've done to achieve it. So that's the first step in Greenovation. The second step is experimenting. And if you think about it, we've only been doing climate action in city government for mostly a decade. Portland has its first climate action plan in 1992, but most cities haven't really become serious about it till 2008, say, at the most. And so you need to try new things. And of course, with experimentation, some things don't always work. And here is the dilemma for elected officials. Nobody wants to be accused of trying something, wasting taxpayer dollars. And so there's a tendency not to experiment. And I think I got this originally from the mayor of Malmö, Sweden, who told his staff, if you're not making mistakes, you're not experimenting. And if you're not experimenting, you're not learning. And it was the first time I heard those words uttered by a mayor. And it really impressed me along the way. The next thing is being a learning organization. And that is, it's not enough to experiment and perhaps make mistakes, but how does the city set up its government in general so that you learn from those mistakes, you learn from what works. And that typically takes what Donald Schoen and Argyris called double loop learning, where it's both the people within the organizational history, but a deliberate process of figuring out what worked and what didn't, and revising after the new experiment has been implemented. Then we have linking climate action to economic development and social equity goals. We know sustainability is a three-legged stool, and it's interesting in some cities how the economic development aspect links. So for example, when San Diego decided it was going to go 100% renewable under a Republican mayor, he had in mind economic development, that all the latest, the tech companies would come there as a result of this. Social equity, in honesty, is often an afterthought in what cities are doing, and it's included in what some cities are doing, but certainly not what's driving it. And I think that's the biggest change we're seeing in this era now. The last thing I have is catching contradictions. And because city governments tend to be siloed, we have our transportation department, we have some cases a special department of sustainability, we have all the different departments. And if you're not watching what each one is doing, it is not uncommon for one department to be doing something contradictory to the goals of another. So for a city, that's really part of being a learning organization, being able to catch those. So moving on, looking at Greenovation, I focus a lot on the three areas that are the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in every city. A lot of cities do an analysis of where their emissions come from, and it's always these in the top three. So the buildings, the energy used in buildings, the energy that's produced to heat and cool and light buildings, and then transportation. And so what I do in Greenovation then is try to look at, okay, how can what a city's doing and which cities are leaders in making those changes connect to an economic development strategy and an equity strategy. And in some cases it's both, and in some cases it's one or the other. So here's the big change again, since Greenovation was published only in March. I feel the landscape has just entirely been transformed in that equity really has to be at the forefront of what a city is doing in its climate action. So let's look at what that looks like. For those in the audience who are architects, you're probably quite familiar with passive house construction and net zero emissions construction. These are two energy standards that I argue, if your city or state is not doing these two as the standard or has a plan for leading to them, you're lagging, you're not leading. And so with passive house, the idea is to orient the building so that it's taking advantage of passive heat, very highly insulated envelope, including the windows, pretty much airtight, but well ventilated, and essentially requires almost no external heating or cooling. Net zero has many of those same principles, but the difference is that it requires that all of the a building's energy needs over a year are produced with either on-site renewable energy or off-site renewable energy. And there's a lot of debate in the field about which one is better. Should cities or states be mandating the renewable energy? But they're both very highly efficient building standards. So in Greenovation, I talk a lot about, okay, if this isn't where your city is, what are the ways that you can build toward this? And New York, both at the state and the city level, is a real leader in passive house construction. I think most people here, almost no external heating and cooling, think you can't do that. You can't do that in a northern climate. You can't do that in a southern climate that requires a lot of air conditioning. But fact of the matter is we can. This standard was developed in Germany. And we're finding that not only can you do it, you can do it in high-rise buildings. And this shows a Cornell building on Roosevelt Island in Manhattan that is at the passive house standard. And New York has quite a few passive house buildings already. And as I said before, is really one of the nation's leaders on this. So we can do this in very high-end buildings. Can we do it in affordable housing is the big question. And in Greenovation, I talk a lot about this development, Onion Flats, in Philadelphia, architect Tim McDonald developed. And he's an architect that just got curious about passive house as a standard and bid on a project to build this, which was ultra low income housing, to see how much more would it cost. And what he found was it cost about 2% more than what regular construction cost at the time. And he was so excited about it that he went to the state agency that gives the credits to developers for developing low income housing and said, hey, why don't you put passive house in the points if the developer will go toward passive house? And they did. And they found the next year, 80% of the developers came in and attempted to do passive house. So McDonald got religion on this. He's been going state by state to get other states. He's gotten 17 of them, and some of them you wouldn't expect, to put points for passive house construction. So it's really interesting how this one architect is trying to drive policy around affordable housing. And the logic is that if you can profitably build affordable housing with passive house, once you know how to do this, you know you're going to be able to command higher rents, higher sales by using it in all construction. And that's the approach New York is taking. And it's interesting, New York got its lesson from the Dutch in the Netherlands, who instituted a program called energy sprawn. And this is their social housing, and wanted to see how they could affordably redevelop social housing to be passive house in its standard. And how they discovered to do this is, well, you don't do it on site because it's too expensive and it takes too long and you have to dislocate people. So they essentially go off-site, build an ectoskeleton that makes the building much more efficient. And then they come in and in a matter of a week are able to place the ectoskeleton right over the building. So here's what they look like afterwards. Very attractive housing. The roofs come in and installed right with the solar panels on them. So here is another strategy for building, for retrofitting. So we know you can build new housing to passive house standard. You can build high-rise to passive house standard. You can build high-end, and you can build low-end affordable housing with the passive house standard in a number of different climates. So here's some just other examples where we talk about energy poverty, and we see that this is kind of motivated by an energy justice position where retrofits on New York City properties and many other cities throughout the state are being done to passive house standard to reduce the energy cost of the residents. But also we see on very high-end properties, we can do retrofits to passive house standard as well. So that takes us to the building part, the building efficiency. What about energy? One of the things we know is that many states and cities and even the federal government have offered quite a bit of subsidy for people to put solar panels on their houses. And the idea is with net metering, you can sell back the energy you don't need and essentially heat, cool, provide electricity for your house at almost no cost. But the problem is that only people who can afford to do it with the subsidies have solar. And so community solar is a way to develop solar energy for those kind of buildings that can't house solar on them, but also for people who couldn't afford to develop solar. So this is an interesting story in Austin, Texas, where Austin Energy is a municipally owned utility. It has been mandated by the city to purchase increasing percentages of its power from renewable energy, much of it from wind in West Texas, but also developing solar. And in one of its solar developments, it went to this community in Austin, La Loma, low-income community, and was about to develop this solar farm as part of its program. Well, Pete Rivera, a long-term community resident, got wind of this and said, if you're developing this here, why aren't we benefiting from it? And by the way, we've got these trash dumps and other things that were supposed to be parks here. And if you're going to do this, why can't you also improve our parks? And he was pretty forceful and was able to negotiate with Austin Energy that just hadn't thought about any of these things before. and negotiated to clean up this area and turn it into a park, but also to negotiate that half of the energy produced by this community solar facility would benefit low-income residents of that community. So they're using the people who buy into the community solar, who can afford it, to subsidize the residents of La Loma. So this is a very interesting example of how you come in with the idea of, okay, we're going to develop community solar, and suddenly it turns into a big E equity project where that community solar is going to benefit the community where it is. There's another example of this, if you can, move me to the side, in West Oakland. And in this case, it's a community that has highways, a waste treatment facility, a peaker plant that was actually fueled by jet fuel. So just about every kind of polluting source you can imagine was there. And so originally the city came in with a program largely subsidized by the state to improve the energy efficiency of the homes. Then they took that a little further and said, we're going to do fuel switching. And that is get fossil fuels out of the buildings. And interestingly, at the time I was writing about this, Rocky Mountain Institute had just released this spring a report looking at pollution from fossil fuels in homes, and gas stoves being a major source of it. And you think about it, you have a hot water tank that has to be vented. Many gas stoves are not properly vented. And so it's no surprise that people have asthma or other conditions as a result of this. So the energy efficiency program became a fuel switching program in this neighborhood. But then the other thing they realized was that the major source of pollution was this jet-fueled peaker plant. So they replaced that with renewable energy, solar energy, plus storage, so that this whole area could become a microgrid and actually, island itself when needed if storms or other things shut off electricity. So this was an example. Electrify everything has become a mantra of climate action. If we really are going to get to these goals that we have for 2050, we've got to stop using fossil fuels. And this movement is very slow because, of course, it's very controversial. It's fought by the fossil fuel industry. But this is one of the first cases that I've seen where it's focused on low-income neighborhoods as the first line of implementation. So let's move on quickly to transportation. One of my favorite cities in this regard is Los Angeles. And you think Los Angeles, the driving city, the smog city. But Los Angeles has been trying to build out a public transportation infrastructure, its subway system. It's slow going. But it's a leader in putting equity at the forefront. And as you see in this illustration, making that distinction between equality and equity and why certain neighborhoods have to be the first line of action. So one of the things Los Angeles is doing, it's one of the few cities in the country that is committed to converting its entire bus fleet to electric. And that hasn't been a real easy transition. They got this company, BYD, Build Your Dreams, a Chinese company, to come in. There were many problems at first until they unionized. And some of the buses didn't work as advertised. And again, going back to that idea of experimentation. If some cities aren't willing to say, we're going to try this, see whether it works or not, then go back and figure out how to make it work, then you don't improve the technology. And so through trial and error, they've got the buses down. It's a unionized shop, and they had BYD commit to hiring people from the low-income communities in Los Angeles. So it's a real good news story in that it encompasses both the economic development and the equity aspects of this. And much of this is the result of the work of Jobs to Move America that came out of an organization in Los Angeles called Lane. They are now working in Chicago, in New York, and other cities around the country saying, wait a minute, if we're going to make huge investments in subways, in buses and electric buses, these ought to be produced here, and we ought to be able to prioritize who gets these good jobs. So it's a story of starting in Los Angeles and then taking that message and that action to other cities. One other aspect of what Los Angeles is doing, like many cities, is trying to build out an electric charging infrastructure and thinking of ways to expand electric vehicles. And when they did this, they developed Blue LA, which is a car sharing service, electric, and they took it into low-income neighborhoods first, and where it's highly subsidized as a way, again, just like renewable energy subsidies, what we see with subsidies for purchasing electric vehicles is that only people who can afford to buy the electric vehicle in the first place can take advantage of the subsidies. And so this is a way of trying to make a more egalitarian move to electrification of transportation. I just want to make a quick point about contradictory policies. So this is London, and what you see in London is, first, you've probably heard of their congestion pricing zone. That was one of the first in the world, very successful in reducing the number of cars by doing pricing that's higher during peak hours. Since then, they've superimposed an ultra low emission zone over that. And what happens in this is that it gets increasingly strict over time. The amount of emissions your car produces means that you eventually can't even come into that zone. And eventually you will have to have an electric vehicle to enter this zone. There's a lot of policies that go with that. And then the other thing that they're doing is the taxi company is now under obligation to electrify all of the taxis in London. And this is also, it's now a Chinese company that's bought out London Taxi. They have a facility in London. It's Geely, where they're producing these taxis or retrofitting taxis. So all sounds great. What's the contradictory policy? Well, London Uber was just allowed in with no restraints whatsoever. So what you see is trying to get this zone where there's fewer cars, trying to get electric vehicles, and suddenly you have hundreds of thousands more vehicles clogging the streets of London. That's finally changed, and Uber has been curtailed in London. But it's a great story of, if you really want to get the cars out, you've got to get the Uber out. So I think I've gone, I don't know what I did with my Providence slide. So I'm just going to stop there and we can enter a conversation. So let me get out of this and stop my screen share.
Thank you very much, Joan. That was really interesting. And being able to take us through energy and building and transportation, and understanding the trade-offs between economic and equity as not necessarily being the trade-offs that people sometimes say they are, that they can actually be knit together through creative and innovative strategies. Through Greenovation, they can actually be addressed through deliberate attempts to be experimental, but also to be judicious in that experimentation. In terms of policies. So it's clear from what you just presented that since the book came out in March, you have not stopped researching at all.
Right. On the next one.
You're ready to go. Keep going. So I just think it's interesting that because, since, and as you're saying, having a book come out in March 2020 is a particularly interesting experience because there's so many other things going on. This landscape that's been completely reshaped by a public health crisis, a social justice movement, and a lot of economic uncertainty, fairly dramatic economic uncertainty. It seems interesting to me that you really sit at the intersection of those three conversations because of the work that you're doing about sustainability is so tied to public health, is so tied to questions of social justice and to economic growth, but also managing change, economic change. So I just think this is a really interesting moment to be having this conversation. And I had kind of a big picture question to ask you, which when I was reading Greenovation and then listening to you talk about this area for the last couple of years, I've been really interested in what sort of, this is a strategy question. It's also a question about the way forward. So in one of your recent pieces for Planet Edison, you mentioned the U.S. Global Change Research Program released another report in 2018. I suspect they released them not infrequently, but that they warned again that climate change disproportionately affects low-income communities and communities of color. And they emphasized that governments need to work closely with those communities to develop solutions, which is the case study that you described, that this is in fact possible. It seems that that the effective strategies for cities and community scale actions to combat climate change are even more important. And we understand and now that we understand that the climate change, when we say climate change affects different places differently, we used to really talk about that as the global scale, as we would understand one nation state might have a more impact from climate change than another one. But really what you're talking about and what we're starting to see in the work on urban sustainability that you highlight is that it's communities and neighborhoods that are at the city scale, one block over, can have a different experience because of climate change. So it does get to this issue of whether, the tangible actions at the global level didn't really manifest themselves, right? The big global agreements that were part of it coming out of the 2000s, even out in the 1990s, that we needed big global agreements, we need to have nation states sign on. That seemed to not be where we went in terms of effective action. The effective action is where you are looking at the city scale and things like changing how we build, changing how we travel, and changing how we consume and produce energy. And I just wonder if clearly you've made that choice to focus there because I suspect you think it's effective. But I wonder if looking back, you think maybe it was a strategic error for the people who were for the advocacy around climate change to focus at the global scale as opposed to the community and city scale in the first instance.
No, I don't, as a matter of fact. I think if we don't address it at the global scale, we're done. And so the fact that the United States chose to get out of the Paris Agreement, which itself wasn't, as strong as everyone wanted, was a big mistake. So that's why we had to work at the local level and at the state level without this. But we need all of it. And cities cannot do this without their state governments in the United States. Cities in Europe, which is the other area I focus, can't do it without the nation, without the EU. And, if we don't have global scale agreements, what happens in China and India, will make what we do in the US and Europe irrelevant. So, but even looking at the cities where I look, let me give you a very localized example. When I talked about electrification and building codes, moving to passive house, I'm in Massachusetts, which gets rated by the ACEEE #1, Boston #1 on energy efficiency year after year after year. Do they deserve it? That's another question, but they do get this rating. But cities in Massachusetts cannot impose a building energy code that's higher than the state. That's mandated. So recently we had Brookline, a suburb of Boston, impose a rule that no new construction or major rehab could have fossil fuel lines going into a building. And our very progressive attorney general just ruled you can't do that. And she was right. You can't do that because that's the state law. So if you want to change the state law, you need to get to that first. I wrote an op-ed in a Commonwealth magazine that said, okay, but we could do this anyway because Massachusetts really is leading on using passive house as a building standard and kind of motivating the business community, the developer community to see that this is possible. Similarly, microgrids. Typically, a microgrid is something that's at a university or a hospital where you can island from the grid when the power goes down. And it's typically, all one owner of that microgrid. So Boston had really wanted to experiment in this industrial park and develop a microgrid that had multiple buildings and building owners. And right now they've been stymied again by the state legislature, which you have to have a home rule exception to do that. So those are just a few examples of, I know, where cities can't take the action they need without support from the state. So if you're in a state like California, where you've got really good legislation at the state level and all kinds of mandates and really good legislation at the city level, then it's great when everything's lined up. But even in a state like Massachusetts, that lining up. So if it's not there in Massachusetts, you can imagine what it's like in Ohio, where the renewable portfolio standard isn't that strong to begin with and has been stopped and started and so forth. So I think you need it all together. And I don't by any means want to say or suggest that cities can do it on their own. So but they can innovate.
Yeah, so it sounds like what your argument would be is that it requires multiscalar coalitions to really do this, and so
absolutely, yeah.
And that it's interesting because that does align with what the social justice movement has always sort of understood as, and the labor movement has always understood that multiscalar coalitions are in fact you have to shift with where the scale of action and intervention. So it's interesting that ended up being where the sustainability action plan ended up.
Absolutely.
I was also really interested in the case study you had about Providence, Rhode Island's climate justice plan, which you were describing that it weaves together the trajectory of social justice action with the environmental justice movement, it's doing that a little bit earlier than many others, right? Very consciously talking about environmental justice when it talks about what a climate justice plan looks like. So it weaves participatory planning together with advocacy planning and community development. And I wonder if if you could talk a little bit about that historical debate in the sustainability literature about trade-offs between environmental and economic goals, and then the trade-offs between equity and sustainability goals, and whether you feel like this is an effective way to sort of balance and find a way forward.
Yeah, I think watching Providence is going to be very interesting going forward on those goals. So just for those who haven't read that piece, so about 4 or 5 years ago, the city of Providence, led by a mayor who established a strong goal for greenhouse gas reductions, and the new sustainability director, working with a number of community organizations, started working on a climate plan, which they ended up calling a climate justice plan. But you're right in terms of participation from the most affected, the frontline communities was part of it. What was interesting about the plan is that the mainline environmental groups were not were not part of this, nor were the business groups. It was really developed by the frontline communities in cooperation with the city departments. So you come out with the plan, and the environmental group said, wait a minute, we weren't involved in this. And if we're going to get to these goals with greenhouse gas reductions, we have to be moving in ways that do involve the typical subsidies. And so their concern was that the equity focus was going to slow down the climate advancement focus. And the business community was concerned that the equity focus was going to slow down the economic development. And how this played out in this neighborhood along the port, the utility wanted to put in a liquid natural gas, a new facility. And the community opposed it. The mayor opposed it because there were already so many fossil fuel-based polluting uses. Finally, the governor came in and said, this is going up, just stop all this. And even the mayor has admitted that this whole fossil fuel infrastructure is essential to the economic development and vitality of the city. So it's going to be interesting to see how those three dimensions that Scott Campbell initially pointed out in his development triangle in JAPA in 1996.
96, I think, right?
96, yeah, is still at play. I think as cities try to move toward this equity focus, we're going to see more of these tensions rising.
Yeah, it occurs to me that the hyper specificity of the solutions, right? So and that is one of the heavy lifts that come with this kind of set of interventions is they are going to be tailored to local conditions and local communities. So the challenge that you described that struck me as really important, that maybe we get more information like your book out there, is this idea of contradictory policies, where sort of the one silo within the city government doesn't quite understand what the other silo is doing, and so they end up working at cross purposes but with the same goal. And I wonder if you could describe, if you have other examples of that sort of situation where just a little bit of undermining of one, not intentional. It sounded like what you were describing was not the question, that it was an intentional undermining, but the actions of one agency would just mitigate the effectiveness of another agency's strategy.
Mm-hmm. One place you see it is stormwater management.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so the whole goal is trying to move toward green and more natural ways rather than everything going into the storm sewer. And, I see it all the time in Boston, where we have lots of brick streets. And the brick streets are really good because they're not cemented, and so the water can permeate down. Yet I see major development projects going on and redoing of streets where they're cementing the bricks in. And so here you have a city policy to move toward more green stormwater management, but yet the streets and sanitation department isn't in on this. And so they're doing it in a way that makes the bricks stay smoother longer rather than bricks popping out and so forth. I did an article several years ago looking at Philadelphia, which became the first city in the country that attempted to not build any more storm sewers, to just go with all green stormwater infrastructure. And similarly, you saw these same objections. The water department develops this wonderful plan, but nobody in streets knows about it. Nobody in recreation knows about it. And so you say, oh, we're going to build permeable pavement streets. And like, wait a minute, we've spent over 100 years getting water off the streets. Now you're telling us it's going to permeate. So I was on a tour, and this is what you typically get when they show you their permeable sidewalks, is they take a bottle of water and pour it and watch it absorb. And the water just sat there. And everyone looks at each other, and the guy was embarrassed. And this one person in our group looked up and said, why don't we do it over there? And we did it over there, and the water went right through. Well, what happened is we were under a tree, and trees give off stuff and it gets into the permeable pavement and clogs it up. So nobody thought of this. And okay, so the streets department has to buy permeable, cleaners so that they can clean these sidewalks so that they continue. So that's just one, little example of kind of a policy. The Brookline policy of saying, okay, we're going to really go for it, get rid of fossil fuels in buildings, runs into a contradictory policy at the state level where they can't do it. So there's endless examples of contradictory. Oh, just one other one. Everyone wants to, reduce traffic. So you have these apps where, if you want to park, it'll tell you where a parking place is. Well, that's good at some level in that it reduces the amount of trolling to find parking spaces, but it makes coming into the city in your car more convenient. So does that really meet the goal of trying to have people use public transportation or bikes or something else? Actually, it facilitates car use.
Yeah, I was interested in the congestion pricing, the London congestion pricing boundary as one of your case studies too, because originally, and you correct me if you know it better than I do, but originally it's for congestion, or so they advertised, right? And the idea was that the congestion piece was going to be you mitigate the number of cars, reduce the number of cars that came into London with a heavy fee for that. And then later, the additional goal of air quality, of increasing, of addressing air quality was layered on to that. Yeah. And I wonder what you think of, if that's the case, if I have it approximately right, what do you think of that sort of layering goals approach? Is it just, it was one of those ones that concerned me, because the idea of the air quality success seemed far less than the congestion success, which was a pretty big success for that policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the layering policies is really an important piece, and I talk about that in the sense of eco districts and so forth. But you're right; they're two very different goals. So most of the electric car infrastructure that's being installed in cities is strictly because they're violating national standards for particulate matter and pollution. Is it contradictory in terms of, well, if we promote electric vehicles, then we're still going to have vehicles versus the congestion pricing, which is trying to get more people in public transit? And that it's a hard balance. But the fact of the matter is, for many reasons, cars are quite convenient, and we're always going to have cars in cities. And so I think it's a both and situation where you have to be moving to get more people in public transit, but at the same time, you have to electrify the vehicles that are left. And that's why it's so important for buses to be, the key thing, and then school buses that cities seek to electrify. And then you just keep moving on both fronts with reducing the number of cars and making sure those that are electric, such as London with, okay, we've got a taxi fleet, we're always going to have a taxi fleet, let's electrify that. And Amsterdam is another leading city. And of course, Oslo is the world's leader in this regard. And it's all Go
So,
ahead.
Joan, with your permission, I am going to bring in the questions from the audience
Okay.
that Yaz Moriyama has for us. I should mention at this moment, too, that Joan and I are not the only people in this virtual room. We have additional people who've made this possible and are making the show work, including our faculty at Baumer Committee, which includes Eric Herman and John Davis, and our own within city planning, Yaz Motoyama. And of course, I want to recognize as well our media and communications coordinator here at Knowlton, Ben Rader. So Yaz, you have some questions for him.
Yes, hi, this is Yasu, your virtual assistant today. We got two questions. One from Bethany. She wants to ask about how to hold city governments accountable to their goals. And so in your opinion, what seems to be the best sector to evaluate their progress? Public, private, or community groups?
I think it depends. It depends on the area. So in terms of accountability, I think San Diego is the only city in the country whose 100% renewable plan they're legally accountable to achieving, and that there are penalties if the city does not move, in that direction at the speed with which they need to be. So one way to do it is to build it into the actual climate action plan where there's a level of accountability, so that it takes it beyond a particular administration that has developed the plan. Community accountability is important, and I think we're going to see that increasingly in these climate justice plans that are being developed, as we saw in Providence and in Austin, where the community just rises up. And I think the best example we can see right now has to do with police violence and the Black Lives Matter movement, where that kind of accountability. And so just looking at today's actions in Rochester, where the police were not going to retire or be fired, and they retired, and now the point is whether or not the mayor is going to leave office, where there's enormous pressure. So much more so in this area do we see communities rising up and demanding accountability. I don't know what it'll take environmentally to see that same kind of pressure from those frontline communities that are the victims of all the polluting sources to rise up. The business community, I see for the most part, that not being a force of holding a city accountable on climate goals. So I think it either comes from the city building it into its own work or bubbling up from the communities.
Thank you, Joan. Yaz, do you have another question from our audience?
Yes, second question came from Nan. Do you think investing in infrastructure of underserved neighborhoods increases the likelihood of gentrification?
Yes, and I think this is the biggest dilemma we have to figure out. And I teach a course called The 21st Century City, and we read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. And I was just at a presentation with him yesterday where he was talking about remedies. So in a nutshell, The Color of Law is a book about deliberate government policy to create segregated neighborhoods throughout the United States. And what that meant is that for most families, your home is your biggest asset, your biggest source of wealth accumulation. And that has been denied the Black community in the United States, for over a century. And so what are the solutions? And he looks at elements such as you have to have a narrow solution. So people were not allowed in Levittown. What you would do is the government would purchase homes in these places where they were denied and then somehow sell them back to the Black community at a rate that was equivalent to what they would have been able to purchase it. That is a very narrow remedy. And so I think what you see, there's kind of, as we talk about in urban planning, you can have people-based solutions or you can have place-based solutions. A people-based solution would be you give people the money to go purchase a house wherever they want to. A place-based solution is what you're asking about, developing the infrastructure. So it would be like what we saw with McDonald, developing really state-of-the-art passive housing in these communities, layering that with green stormwater management and more access to parks, layering that with electric vehicles and bike rental programs that are subsidized, layering that with better quality schools. What is the likelihood of that happening? Hard to say. Depends on the election. State and city governments are really troubled right now. But then the big dilemma is how do you do that in a way without creating gentrification? And so many cities are experimenting with rent control again as one way of doing that. I know one of the communities I follow here in Boston has an eco-innovation district, and many of the low-income housing developers are creating green, affordable housing around transportation hubs. So it's possible, but it really has to be the policy of local and state government to prevent gentrification and to put those policies into place as we develop these communities. And we haven't been able to prevent that from happening in many places so far. So we'll see whether we can going forward. But it's a good question. It is the question, I think, facing many cities.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. Third question came in from Ryan. What do you make of the Green New Deal? Is there a way that it could be successfully implemented without costing trillions in taxpayer dollars?
Well, it's when you say the Green New Deal, first want to clarify that the original Green New Deal was just a kind of vague outline. Since then, the Center for American Progress, there's been 4 or 5 versions of a Green New Deal, how much needs to be spent and so forth. I absolutely support this. And all of these demonstrate that the amount of investment is usually about 2% of GDP, and that the jobs created and more than compensates for the expenditure. And so, yes, I support it because I think we need to make a transformation away from the fossil fuel economy. There needs to be a lot of investment in renewable sources, in electrification of transportation, in creating more resilient communities, into upgrading the grid. Many of these things need to be done anyway, and to do them in a much more intensive way would create millions of jobs. All the analysis shows that the net of people who would lose jobs in the fossil fuel industry and the jobs that would be created in the new green technologies is much, much higher. So I think it's an investment the nation absolutely needs to make. The question is not, do you support the Green Deal, but do you support the cost of what will happen if we don't address climate change? I mean, just look at what's going on in California now with the fires, and you look at the flooding in other places. I mean, those costs are just going to, be for fixing things to the extent you can without creating jobs. So I think to get a hold of that and move us forward in green technologies is definitely the way we need to go.
Thank you very much. Those are the questions so far. So turning back to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Yaz. I appreciate so much, John, that you brought up the people-based versus place-based comparison of how we think about planning and also urban policy, because I think I just spent last week talking to my class about how useful that understanding that really is when you come to particularly innovative solutions. If you don't have a clear sort of typology or set of categorizations, it becomes very complicated to understand what you're trying to explain to us, which is that there is the potential for layering of policies in order to get more efficacy out of the overall move towards the goal. And the idea that we only have one policy intervention in front of us or one planning intervention in front of us is narrow. It's sort of backwards thinking rather than the sort of creative forward thinking that we need to challenge something like climate change in an effective way. So I really appreciate you bringing us back to the framework, but the framework that moves us forward at the same time.
Well, and it's a very old framework, and I think it shouldn't be thought of as either or. It's both and. I remember being at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where we did a lot of work in the communities. And, from the legacy of Harold Washington, it was about community development. And John Foster Bay came to the MacArthur Foundation and wrote this white paper about you shouldn't just have place-based, you need people-based strategies. And everyone was up in arms about it. And I remember making the case that here we are, white professionals, most of whom own their own homes or even have second homes. Should I be saying to people living in poor communities that you have to stay there? We're going to do place-based interventions. I've never felt comfortable with that, but I also think that for people who want to be in their communities and want to work on improving those, that's what we do as urban planners in working with them. But it's funny historically how that gets played out as this either or way of thinking about how we improve quality of life for more urban residents.
Yeah, it's a very helpful way to remind us that we have so many different tools in front of us. We just have to actually think more about it, and that's part of the challenge for us.
Mm-hmm.
So, Joan, unless you have any more questions or would like to tell us anything additional, I think that we have come to the end of our hour here. I want to thank you for your time with us today and for the presentation. I know my students were really, really looking forward to hearing about how you got to the place of pivoting towards sustainability after your work that was more focused on economic development. And I wonder if you can just wrap us up with just a little bit about how you made that choice.
Interesting question. Well, in the book, the 2003 book, economic development book that I did with Nancy Greenlee, we asked the question, what would urban economic development practice look like if equity and sustainability were the two top priorities? How would that change the practice? And at that point, I was focusing much more on the economic development side. I had always been engaged locally in sustainability and environmental organizations. And I think in Emerald Cities, one of the things that I wanted to do was that exact pivot to say, okay, what if we put environment first? Then how would economic development play around it? And what I found in Emerald Cities is that at the time, and this was when Bush was first elected in 2008, the book came out in 2010, that for many cities, particularly Rust Belt cities, you couldn't afford to be thinking about sustainability at the forefront. If there wasn't an economic development angle to it, it wasn't a priority. But if you could make the case, there's a big economic development angle to it, then this really works. And so that was the pivot for Emerald Cities. I think in Greenovation, what motivated it is just oh my goodness, we're not getting where we need to be at all. And we've got to make that economic development connection. But now, we also have to prioritize the equity aspect. So they've all been there, but it's, different levels in different things that I've done.
And what's next?
The book is called Climate Just Cities, and I've been working through these blog posts on Planetizen, working through some of the ideas from it. The article that includes Providence, I'm about to submit to the Journal of the American Planning Association, looks at participation in that transition. And so I'm not exactly sure where the book is going, but this one obviously will have equity, as you saw in those slides, the big E in the book.
Well, we're looking forward to that when it comes out, and the JAPA article as well in the meantime, and look forward to following your work.
Great.
So thank you.
Thank you all for having me. This was, I would have loved to do it right there, but still happy to be doing this.
Well, we were glad to have you back, and we will have you back in person soon.
Hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.